America currently has a president whose opponent received millions of more votes than he did. This isn't the first time it's happened. Just a few elections ago in 2000, George Bush took the presidency even though fewer people casted votes for him than they did Al Gore.
Thank you very much, and God bless America.
This is only possible because in America, some people's votes are just worth more than others. This graph right here tells most of the story. If you live in a rural area, your vote is actually worth about 1 1/5 of a vote. And then, of course, people who live in rural areas tend to be much whiter than the national average, meaning white people's votes overall are worth more than non-whites. In fact, the average Hispanic American's vote is actually worth about 9/10 of a vote. And you can see here that white people's vote is worth about 5% more than African American votes. These discrepancies add up tremendously when millions and millions of votes are cast. For every 5 white people from the suburbs that vote, the Electoral College casts an extra vote for them. And for every 5 Hispanic Americans that vote, the Electoral College actually takes away half of a vote. This is how candidates can win the presidency while having less people vote for them than their opponents. Because in America, it's not about how many voters are on your side, it's about what kind of voters are on your side. Because some people's votes are just worth more than others. This is all because of the Electoral College. In America, elections aren't really about getting people to vote for you. It's about getting certain people who live in certain places to vote for you. Because people don't really vote for presidents after all, states do. And your personal voting power depends entirely on the state you live in. What's worse is the Electoral College distributes this voting power unevenly with a strong bias towards small states. Here's how it all works. The Electoral College hands out a number of electoral votes to each state. The number of votes that each state gets is equal to the amount of senators and representatives it sends to Congress. Whatever candidate wins that state by however small of a margin receives all of these votes. Now, there are 538 handed out in total. So if we do some simple math and take the population of the United States divided by 538, we can see that if these votes were distributed on proportionate population, each vote would represent about 607,000 people. So if we take a state like Texas, which has a population of 28.7 million, and divide it by 607,000, we can see that Texas should have about 47 electoral votes. But it doesn't, it has 38. So where do these electoral votes go? To small states like Wyoming. Wyoming has a population of 577,000, which should net at just 1 vote, but instead it gets 3. This happens because each state has at least 2 senators and 1 House rep, and is therefore guaranteed at least 3 electoral votes, no matter how small they are. The problem is there are many states without enough people to justify 3 votes on their own, so they have to take them from big states. This causes huge discrepancies in electoral representation all over the map. Today, 6 states in DC get at least 2 times more electoral votes than they would under an equal population system, while states like Texas and California each get 15% fewer electoral votes. Simply put, this means that 1 person's vote from Wyoming counts as much as 4 people's votes in California. 1 person's vote from Arkansas, that's worth 3 people's votes from Texas. The system artificially inflates the voting power of people who live in small states, while systematically removing it from people who live in big states. People who live in these small states average out to be much whiter and more likely to be Republican, creating an unsurprising set of demographic effects that translate to the white and rural people's votes just simply being worth more, much more than non-white people or people who live in cities. In other words, people who are more likely to be Democrats. All this combined creates a scenario where the average Republican voter is granted this tremendous favor by the Electoral College, which makes their votes just simply worth more than everyone else's. The Electoral College is weird. No other country uses anything like it, and the United States doesn't use it to elect any of its other politicians, like governors or senators. Its weirdness makes more sense when you realize exactly what it is. While a lot of its defenders will frame it as some thoughtful, principled design of the Founding Fathers, that's not really true. It was a slapdash, hurried compromise to make slave states happy during the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. James Madison wrote in a letter to George Hayes about the Electoral College, as the final arrangement of it took place in the latter stage of the session, it was not exempt from a degree of the hurrying influence produced by fatigue and impatience in all such bodies.
They were having a very hard time at the Philadelphia Convention figuring out how they were going to select the chief executive. And there were a bunch of different proposals, but one kind of obvious one was you could just have a popular vote and voters would select the executive. The problem with that was the slave states, if you had direct popular election, then the slaves of southern slave owners would count for nothing, and slaves were about 35-40% of the southern population, and slave owners thought that their political power should partly reflect their slaveholding. So southern slave owners were very opposed to the idea of direct popular election.
This is Michael Klarman, Harvard professor and author of The Framers' Coup. This protesting by small slave states would result in two compromises, the Electoral College and the 3/5 Compromise. While U.S. law obviously treated and categorized slaves as property, slave owners still demanded that they count towards their political representation.
Southerners were insisting their slaves count for something, and the compromise was the 3/5 rule in the House, which is representation in the House as a portion according to population, with slaves counting 3/5 of other persons. Now, that got incorporated in the Electoral College. There was no chance that you could have direct election of the president because slaves wouldn't count. And direct election of the president, only voters count, and slaves would count for nothing, and Southerners would simply have refused to go along with that.
Both of these compromises were explicitly designed as a political handout to the South, made in a country that was less than 100 years from a civil war just over the subject of slavery. They greatly inflated the political power of the rural South and had an immediate and profound impact on the ideological direction of the early United States.
Because of structural mechanisms like the 3/5 Compromise, which inflated the political power of Southerners, most presidents actually came from the South before the Civil War, even though the South was a distinct minority of the nation's population. And even the presidents who did not come from the South tended to be Northerners with pro-slavery, pro-Southern inclinations. If there had not been a 3/5 rule, Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected president in 1800. He only won the presidency because slaves counted 3/5 both in the House of Representatives and therefore in the Electoral College.
So right off the bat, the Electoral College was a major structural advantage to the American right, and still is. The partisan bias we see today is no fluke, and it's not a coincidence that Republicans are the ones who keep winning the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. If the electoral votes had actually been proportionate to population, George Bush loses the 2000 election. 200 years later, the Electoral College is continuing to elect right-wing presidents by valuing small state voters over everyone else. But the uneven distribution of electoral votes isn't the only way candidates can win the presidency while losing the popular vote. There is one more critical failure of the Electoral College: swing states. The Electoral College uses what's become known as the winner-take-all system. This means that even if a candidate wins a state by one vote, it receives all of that state's electoral votes. It's what's responsible for those electoral maps where each state is a clearly defined red or blue, when in reality, if you were to map out every vote that was cast in 2016, it would look like this. Within this kind of system, basic game theory would have candidates ignore states where they poll well as states where they don't stand a chance. Instead, candidates are incentivized to focus all of their time and money on the small handful of competitive swing states, which is exactly what they do. In 2016, 2/3 of campaign visits were in just 6 states, and 99% of total spending happened in just 14. These so-called swing states introduce randomness into the system, and that randomness dramatically affects whose voices get heard during the campaign.
Yeah, I think that the problem with the Electoral College is that people don't think about the practical consequences because of the way states allocate electors. And so the practical consequence is that the only states that matter in a presidential election are the swing states, states that could go one way or the other. And those states are obviously the most purple states in America, but they don't represent America because the demographics of those states are older, they're whiter, their industry is not sort of cutting-edge industry. So again, like if you think about the number of people who work in solar energy in America, that number is 7.5 times the number of people who mine coal. But you never see presidential candidates talking about people who are in solar energy because those people come from states that are not swing states. You always see them talk about coal miners because those people happen to be in swing states.
That was Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig, who's right now spearheading a crowd-funded legal challenge against the Electoral College over at Equal Citizens. So, the Electoral College not only gives us presidents who receive fewer votes, it also warps the direction of our country by making our entire system move towards placating the needs of a random selection of competitive swing states.
You know, when President Trump was elected, almost immediately he wanted to end offshore drilling restrictions. And almost immediately, the state of Florida got a waiver from that change. But the state of New Jersey couldn't even get a hearing because New Jersey's not a swing state, but Florida is a swing state. So you see policies in America bending in favor of swing states and against America as a whole or against states that are not swing states. And you know, when you recognize that, you have to step back and say, why? What's the reason to have a president who cares not about America as a whole, but cares about this arbitrary set of 14 states that happen to be swing states. And that problem is not a problem given to us by the framers of the Constitution. It's not a problem given to us by anybody who actually intended it. It's just an accidental byproduct of the way that we have allowed states to develop the allocation of their electors in the Electoral College.
Trump's combined popular vote margin in Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan, and Wisconsin was under 250,000. But those victories netted him 75 electoral votes, over a fourth of the total needed to win the presidency. That's the power swing states hold, and a big part of the reason why it has been so difficult to change. But there was a point in time when we were really close.
Senator Bye, I understand your subcommittee on constitutional amendments has recently concluded hearings on electoral college reform. What action do you believe will now be taken on direct popular elections?
Well, it's always exceptionally difficult to amend the Constitution. I found that out when we were working with the 25th Amendment, which I introduced, and then it was almost 3.5 years later before it became a part of the Constitution. I think it's fair to say that we have a better chance today to get this revision in our electoral process than we've ever had before. I think most people are aware that the present system is dangerous, it's outdated, it's archaic, it's one that needs to be revised and made responsive to the needs of today's electoral problems. In my judgment, reform should meet a three-point criteria. I think the people should be personally involved. I think everybody's vote should count the same. And I think, in the final analysis, the man who wins is the man who gets the most votes.
That was Indiana Senator Birch Bayh. To change the Electoral College, you're more than likely going to have to amend the Constitution. This means getting approval from 2/3 of the Senate and the House, good luck there, or calling a constitutional convention with 2/3 of state legislators, also a long shot. But Bayh had some kind of constitutional amendment superpower. He's the only non-founding father to have authored 2 constitutional amendments, the 25th, which is boring, and the 26th, which lowered the voting age to 18. Bayh's campaign became incredibly popular, polling well with Democrats and Republicans at around 80% at its highest. He certainly wasn't the first to challenge it. In fact, no part of our Constitution has had as many reformation attempts as the Electoral College. People have tried over 700 times, and no one has ever come as close as Birch Bayh. Adopting a direct vote for president was the logical, realistic, and proper continuation of this nation's tradition and history, a tradition of continuous expansion of the franchise inequality in voting. Bayh's argument was largely that the Electoral College didn't conform to America's modern conception of democracy. When the Constitution was written, the Founding Fathers limited democracy to white landowners, and it makes sense that a system designed within these confines should be done away with, just as every other voting restriction has been. In September 1969, the House voted overwhelmingly to abolish the Electoral College and replace it with a direct popular vote. President Nixon was on board, and polls of state legislators showed strong support all throughout the country. There was one problem. Strom Thurmond, famous racist and segregationist, was fully aware of how the Electoral College was formed to appease southern states and how the Electoral College still warped national politics in his favor. He led a group of segregationists to filibuster the bill, and it died on the Senate floor. Bayh kept trying into the 70s until he was finally booted out of office in the Reagan Revolution, but never came as close as his initial push. Birch Bayh, the constitutional amendment superhero, couldn't get it done.
People will come up with justifications for why the system ought to remain in place, but they're just post hoc rationalizations by people who see the advantages to them of the Electoral College system, but there really is no justification for it. This is just an effort to defend an obsolete institution because it provides benefits to some interest groups.
So changing the Electoral College via amendment is so difficult because of just how many states benefit so strongly from its existence. This is why recent activism around Electoral College reform has come up with ways to avoid DC altogether through things like the National Popular Vote Pact and Lawrence Lessig's Equal Votes lawsuit.
So we helped initiate 4 lawsuits in 2 red states and 2 blue states, where Republicans in blue states and Democrats in red states are suing to say this system of winner-take-all violates our rights as citizens of the United States because we vote for president, but our vote is basically thrown away because there's no chance that it would ever be counted in the final count to determine who the president of the United States is. So our idea was to challenge this in a completely cross-partisan way to force the court to address the question whether this winner-take-all system violates one person, one vote, this constitutional principle at the core of our tradition. And we're optimistic the court, when it gets a chance to consider the question, will sort of recognize that we've evolved this system It has nothing to do with what our framers wanted and has produced a president who's not responsive to what America wants, and there's no reason to continue that system.
Our own 14th Amendment contains what's called the one person, one vote rule, and Lessig's lawsuit hinges on the idea that the Electoral College clearly violates this principle. I think he's right, and I have high hopes for his case. The other contender, the National Popular Vote, removes itself even from the courts, at least for now. National Popular Vote is an interstate pact where states sign on and essentially say whoever wins the popular vote gets our electors, regardless of how our state votes. This would mean that as soon as enough states to equal 270 electoral votes have signed on, we would essentially loophole ourselves into a popular vote. As of now, 15 states totaling 189 votes have signed on, all of them Democratic. Both of these efforts show promise and are absolutely worth supporting, and check the description below for more info on both of these. What's troubling is the biases in the Electoral College are only getting worse. More and more Democrats are further concentrating themselves in big cities, resulting in more Americans getting their voting power stripped away each year. Right now, half of the US population lives in just 9 states. This also means that half of the population share just 18 senators, another aspect of this age of minority rule that we'll get into in another video. Views on the Electoral College are obviously very partisan. 75% of Democrats favor an amendment to abolish it versus Republicans 32%. But it's worth remembering that there was a time when 80% of the country recognized the anti-democratic nature of the Electoral College and its basic unfairness.
It's critical to begin to push the basic values or principles that show why this is problematic. And those values, in my view, are just the values of a representative democracy. A democracy should be representative, which means that citizens should have equal political power, which means that you can't have systems that systematically disenfranchise people based on their political, party, which is what we basically have right now. The way in which we've allowed these systems to evolve such that we no longer have majority democracy. And majoritarianism is a really important part of our tradition, and we've kind of lost that sense of majoritarianism indeed. And obviously right now that benefits Republicans in a very important way. And I think that's counterproductive because I don't think that a democracy can survive if it consistently, awards to the minority control of the government.
There is so much wrong with American democracy outside of the Electoral College. From voter suppression to gerrymandering to the very structure of the Senate, we are in desperate need to revamp the whole thing. But the Electoral College is a very obvious and simple first step to take. It makes fools out of us every 4 years, its problems are only getting worse, and it begs the question as to whether America can really call itself a democracy at all. One person, one vote. This is the basic principle of democracy. We even have this enshrined in our own 14th Amendment, and yet every 4 years we completely ignore this when it comes to selecting the next president, where we readily accept the fact that in America, some people's votes matter more than others.
Let's figure out what the principles of a representative democracy should be, and let's argue about those. Let's get to an agreement about those. And if we get to an agreement about those, then certain things follow. And one of the things, the most important things that follow are these types of changes to make sure that we actually have representativeness. And I fear that the long-term viability of a representative democracy that doesn't represent its people is not optimistic.
Thanks for watching.